What would you do if the only man who ever loved you left you a ranch and the law took it from you before his grave had even settled? What if you knew, somewhere in your bones, that the paper they waved in your face was a lie, but you had no way to prove it, no money to fight it, and nowhere left to sleep but the back of a freight wagon? And what if, 12 years later, you walked back onto that same dirt with $42 in your pocket, not knowing that the answer to everything, the debt, the death, the reason your father's hands shook every time he mentioned the name Corwin was buried 6 feet under the floor of his own barn? This is the story of Clara Voss, of Bitter Creek in the Dakota Territory, and of a barn that kept a secret for longer than most men keep a promise. It is a story about paperwork that kills quieter than bullets, about a hammer that outlasted the hand that swung it, and about the particular kind of justice that takes 12 years to arrive but arrives anyway. Settle in. Wherever you're watching this from, whatever kitchen, whatever porch, whatever place you call home tonight, tell me in the comments before we begin. Because by the end of this, you're going to want to say something. Thomas Voss built his ranch out of nothing, the way most men in that country did, which is to say he built it out of debt and stubbornness in roughly equal measure. By the spring of 1877, he had 400 acres of grass along Bitter Creek, 11 horses, a wife buried under a cottonwood tree, and a daughter, Clara, who by the age of 9 could already tell you the difference between a horse favoring a stone bruise and one favoring a strained tendon just by the sound of its hoofbeat on hard-packed clay. Thomas was a farrier before he was a rancher, and he never fully stopped being one. The forge sat 40 feet from the house, and on winter evenings, the orange light of it was the last thing Clara saw before sleep and the first thing she saw on waking. He taught her to read a horse before she could read a book. He taught her that a shoe fitted wrong would cripple an animal slower than a bullet, but just as surely. And he taught her, above all, the one lesson he repeated so often it became less an instruction and more a kind of prayer. Listen to the metal before you strike it. It will tell you where it wants to bend. He gave her a hammer for her 12th birthday, not a toy, not a keepsake, but a working farrier's hammer, its head worn smooth on one face from years in his own grip before he passed it to her. She used it. She shoed her first horse alone at 13, badly, and her second one better, and by 16 the ranch hands no longer flinched when Thomas sent her out to the corral instead of going himself. Her mother was gone. Her father was, for all practical purposes, both parents at once, and the two of them ran 400 acres together with the kind of wordless coordination that only comes from 12 years of shared labor. He rose before dawn, and she rose with him. He drank his coffee black and standing, watching the light come up over the eastern fence line, and more mornings than not he handed her the second cup without a word, because some conversations don't need to start with speech. There was a rhythm to those years that Clara only recognized as a rhythm once it had stopped. Monday was for the herd, Tuesday for the fences, and any evening the forge was lit was an evening she was welcome in it, provided she kept her sleeves rolled and her hair pinned back from the sparks. Thomas talked more at the forge than anywhere else in his life, not about feelings, which he had no vocabulary for and no apparent need of, but about iron and horses and the particular dishonesty of a nail driven at the wrong angle to save a minute's work. A shortcut in shoeing, he told her once, turning a glowing shoe with his tongs, watching the color of the metal the way another man might study a hand of cards, walks itself lame 3 counties from here, where you'll never see it happen and never have to answer for it. That doesn't make it not your fault. She heard that sentence enough times that it stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like the shape of the world. It was in later years the sentence she returned to most often, though she could not always have said why. It was, by any measure available to her, a good life, and she had no particular reason at 19 to imagine it would not go on being one. It ended on the 9th of November, 1889, on a morning cold enough that the water trough had skinned over with ice and Thomas had cursed it, mildly, while breaking the surface with the flat of an axe. He went to the corral to shoe a gelding that had been favoring its left fore since Tuesday. Clara was in the kitchen, kneading bread, when the hired hand, a boy named Ezra, 16 and easily frightened, came through the door without knocking, which he had never once done in the 2 years he'd worked the place, and she knew before he said a word that something in the order of things had broken. Thomas Voss's heart had stopped somewhere between the second nail and the third. He was found face down in the dirt of his own corral, the gelding standing over him, uninjured and patient, and the hammer still closed in his right hand, as though even in falling he had not been willing to let go of it. Clara was 19. The man who came to see her 3 weeks after the funeral wore a gray wool coat that had never once, in Clara's estimation, been within 100 yards of actual ranch work. His name was Elias Corwin, and he held, among other things, the mortgage papers for half the ranches along Bitter Creek and a seat on the territorial land board that nobody quite remembered voting him into. He arrived by carriage rather than on horseback, which was itself a kind of statement in that country where a man's willingness to sit a saddle was often taken as a measure of his willingness to do honest work. He knocked once, waited for Clara to answer, and stepped inside without being asked, removing his hat with the practiced courtesy of a man who had performed this particular errand often enough to have smoothed away any hesitation in it. He did not raise his voice. He did not, so far as Clara could later recall, change his expression at all. He sat uninvited in the chair her father had always taken at the head of the table, and he opened a leather case and withdrew a single sheet of paper with the unhurried care of a man laying out a hand of cards he already knew he'd won. He informed her in the flat and courteous tone of a man reading a grocery list that her late father had taken out a note against the ranch in the amount of $1,140 in the spring of 1888, that the note was now in default, and that under the terms of the Bitter Creek Land and Trust Company's standard agreement, the property, house, barn, forge, and 400 acres was now forfeit. Clara said her father had never signed such a note. She had kept his books herself since she was 15. She knew every dollar that passed through that house. Corwin produced the paper. The signature at the bottom was her father's, or close enough to it that Clara, staring at it in the lamplight with her hands shaking, could not say with certainty that it was forged, only that she did not remember it, and that not remembering it felt like the same thing as knowing. "I take no pleasure in this, Miss Voss," Corwin said, and folded the paper back into his coat. "Business is business, whatever season it arrives in. You have until the 15th to vacate." He did not ask about the funeral. He did not ask what she intended to do with an empty winter and no home in it. He simply stood, put on his hat, and walked to his carriage, and Clara watched him go and understood, with the particular clarity of grief, that whatever grief was, it was not going to save her. She left with a horse, a bedroll, $40 sewn into her petticoat, and her father's hammer, which she had taken from the forge the night before the 15th, because she could not make herself leave it for a stranger to sell. The next 12 years do not make for a tidy story, and Clara never told them as one. She worked as a laundress in 3 towns, whose names she later had trouble keeping straight: Millard's Ford, Kane Junction, a rail depot town that seemed to change its name every time a new company bought the spur line running through it. She learned the particular ache of hands kept wet 12 hours a day, an ache different in kind from the ache of forge work, less honest somehow, though she was careful never to say so, where anyone could hear her complain. She learned to disappear into a room, the way a woman without money learns to, taking up as little space and as little notice as the work allowed. There were, in those years, offers of a different kind of arrangement from men who mistook her situation for an invitation, and she turned each of them down flatly enough that word generally got around not to try twice. There was a winter in Kane Junction when she came within $4 of not eating for the better part of a week, and ate anyway, because a woman who ran the boarding house kitchen noticed the $4 weren't there and set a plate down without comment. Clara never forgot that plate. She thought of it later more often than she thought of Corwin. She worked 6 months in a boarding house kitchen in a mining camp called Ash Hollow, a played-out silver town 200 miles west of Bitter Creek, where the ore had given out in 1884 and most of the buildings stood empty, sagging slowly back into the hillside they'd been built against. It was not a town anyone chose to stay in for its prospects. It was a town people stayed in because leaving required money they didn't have, and Clara, by then 28 and long past, expecting her fortunes to turn on anything but her own labor, had made a kind of peace with staying there indefinitely. It was in Ash Hollow in the spring of 1901 that she saw the notice pinned to the door of the Territorial Land Office, a tax auction of forfeited and abandoned parcels, Bitter Creek County, to be held the 3rd Saturday of June. Among the parcels listed in small print near the bottom was a name she had not seen written down in 12 years. Voss T, 400 acres, improvements, dwelling collapsed. Barn, Pashal, forge with a minimum bid of $42. Nobody wanted it. The dwelling had fallen in. The barn roof had gone. The land itself was decent grass, but nothing special, and the town of Bitter Creek had shrunk in her absence, the way towns do when a land company decides a place has served its purpose. She had $41 in change to her name, most of it saved a nickel at a time over 6 years of other people's dirty linens. She walked 11 miles to borrow the last dollar from a woman who ran the Ash Hollow boarding house and had grown fond of her. And on the third Saturday of June, 1901, Clara Voss bought back 400 acres of her father's ranch for $42 even, paid in coin, counted twice by a clerk who did not recognize her name and would not have cared if he had. The barn had not fallen so much as folded the roof caved inward along the ridge beam. The north wall bowed out at a lean that suggested another hard winter would finish what time had started. Clara camped the first 2 weeks in the one corner of the loft that still held a roof over it, and she began alone with a borrowed crowbar and her father's hammer to take the structure apart before it could take itself apart on top of her. It was slow work, and it was not romantic work. She spent 4 days clearing collapsed roofing timber before she could even see the floor of the barn clearly. She reset the north sill on jack salvage from a defunct freight company, working the screws a quarter turn at a time over the better part of a week, so the wall would rise without further cracking the frame. She rebuilt the loft ladder from planks pried out of the old hay chute. Her hands, which had gone soft with years of laundry work, split and blistered and then slowly calloused back into the shape they'd once held. Each stage of it demanded a different patience. Clearing the fallen roof timber meant working alone with a rope and a come-along salvage from an abandoned freight shed, dragging beam after beam clear of the frame before she could risk standing beneath what remained of it. Resetting the sill meant lying flat under the wall in the dirt she'd once played in as a girl, packing shims by feel because the angle didn't allow for sight, and she developed over that first month a private catalog of aches, one for the shoulders from the come-along, one for the palms from the crowbar, one for the knees from the crawling that she came to think of, without much sentiment, as the cost of the thing, paid in installments. She rebuilt what tools she could and bought the rest on credit from a hardware man in the rebuilt Bitter Creek Township who remembered her father well enough to extend it. She rehung the barn doors twice before she got the pitch of the hinges right. She'd spent the better part of 3 days simply sharpening the crosscut saw, the draw knife, the froe she used for splitting shakes because her father had taught her that dull tools cost more time than they saved, a lesson she'd nearly forgotten in 12 years of scrub brushes and washboards, and was glad, in a distant way, to relearn. She was not, by then, entirely alone in her labor, though she had not asked for company. A neighboring rancher named Jedediah Pruitt, 61 years old, given to sitting on his porch with a rifle across his knees, and an opinion about everyone within 10 miles, rode over twice in her first month for the sole apparent purpose of telling her the barn wasn't worth the nails holding it together, and that she'd be smarter to sell the parcel back to the land company and take up laundry again, a trade at which, he pointed out, she at least had proven competence. "You'll have that wall down on your own head before the frost," Jed told her the second time, watching her set a brace with a level of skepticism usually reserved for men trying to sell him patent medicine. Clara didn't argue with him. She finished setting the brace, checked it with a plumb line, and asked him to hand her the mallet. He handed her the mallet. He came back a third time, 2 weeks later, uninvited, with a spare crosscut saw, and did not leave again until October. Between them, they raised the ridge beam in 4 days of work that neither one would have managed alone, Jed working the block and tackle, while Clara guided the beam's angle from below, calling adjustments in the same clipped shorthand her father had once used with her at the forge. They reshake the roof through the better part of July, splitting cedar in the mornings before the heat came up and laying courses in the cooler hours of late afternoon, and by the first week of August, the barn had a roof, for the first time in over a decade, sound enough to keep the coming winter's snow where it belonged, which was outside. Jed's skepticism did not vanish so much as it changed shape. He stopped telling her the barn wasn't worth saving and started, instead, pointing out with the air of a man who had arrived at the observation independently and owed nobody an apology for having doubted at first that a body could do worse than watch how Thomas Voss's daughter set a brace. Months passed in this fashion, the two of them working from first light to last, the frame rising a beam at a time, until only the floor remained. The last section of the barn to come apart was the floor itself, hand-hewn planks laid over packed earth, most of them rotted through near the old stall partitions where rain had gotten in for a decade. Clara and Jed were pulling the boards up one at a time in the third week of August, intending to relay the whole floor before winter, when Jed's crowbar caught on something under the third to last plank that was not dirt and was not rock. It was an iron strongbox, roughly 2 feet by 14 inches, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth and had rotted mostly to fiber, buried perhaps 18 inches down in a pit that had clearly been dug and refilled with some care years before the barn floor was ever laid over it. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Jed, who had spent 4 months telling Clara the barn was worth less than the effort of saving it, looked at the box and then at her and said nothing at all, which from Jed amounted to an apology. It took a chisel and the better part of an hour to force the lock, which had rusted solid inside, wrapped in oilskin that had fared better than the outer cloth. Clara found her father's second ledger, not the household accounts she'd always known, but a separate book, its cover unmarked, filled in his own hand with entries going back to 1879. Beneath it lay a bundle of letters tied with wax twine, several land deeds bearing names Clara did not recognize, and a folded document, considerably older than the rest, headed in a clerk's formal copperplate record of removal, Talsani Creek allotment, County of Bitter Creek, October 1871. They spread it all out on the plank table in what remained of the house, by lamplight, and it took 3 nights of careful reading, Clara's eyes on the numbers, since numbers had always been her father's language and hers besides, before the shape of it became clear. The second ledger was not a record of Thomas Voss's finances. It was a record of somebody else's kept, evidently, because Thomas had once done bookkeeping work for the Bitter Creek Land and Trust Company in its earliest years, before he'd saved enough to buy his own herd and walk away from the company's employ. The entries traced a pattern of loans issued against land already owned outright, loans whose terms made default all but certain, and foreclosures that followed within a year or two of each loan with a regularity that no honest lender's book would show. 16 ranches over 22 years, each one absorbed into the land and trust holdings, each one bearing, at the bottom of its file, the same signature, E. Corwin. Clara worked the ledger the way her father had taught her to work any set of books, column against column, date against date, never trusting a total until she had rebuilt it herself from the entries beneath it. She found, on the second night, that the 16 foreclosures fell into an unmistakable pattern once laid side by side. Each loan issued in an amount just large enough to be unpayable within the season, each secured against land the borrower already owned free and clear, each one entered in a second, smaller column in her father's hand that appeared nowhere in the company's public books, a column headed Simply Paid, followed by a name that was never Corwin's and never the borrower's, but always, in every one of the 16 cases, the same 3 initials, A.W. The letters were harder reading. Several were addressed to Thomas from a man named Aaron Whitcomb, a former company surveyor, and they made reference carefully in the guarded language of men who knew a letter could be read by someone other than its intended recipient to the Talsani business, and to a payment of $6,000 made to the Territorial Land Office in 1871 to clear title on ground that had, until that October, belonged to a band of Talsani families who had farmed and grazed it for 2 generations under a treaty boundary later redrawn on paper by the same office that took the payment. One letter, dated 1883 and considerably more direct than the others, accused Thomas of holding the surveyor's silence over his head in exchange for his own, a debt of complicity. Whitcomb called it, that neither man had ever settled, and both had apparently agreed, by some unspoken understanding, never to raise again above a whisper. Clara read that letter 3 times before she set it down. It did not excuse her father. It did not, she thought, ask to be excused. It only explained, in the plainest terms available, why a man who kept honest books his whole working life had also kept, without ever using it, the one document that could have brought the whole structure down around Elias Corwin's ears 20 years before it finally did. The removal document itself was the coldest thing in the box. It's recorded in the bloodless language of bureaucracy the relocation of the Talsani band from Talsani Creek, the same creek that renamed ran through what was now Corwin's largest holding following an incident described only as resistance encountered. Matter resolved. No further detail was given. None, Clara understood, looking at the date and the payment recorded beside it, was needed. Her father had not written the document. He had only kept it for 20 years in a strongbox under his own barn floor, as though he had known that someday someone would need it and had not been able to bring himself to destroy the only proof, nor entirely to use it himself. He knew, Clara said to Jed in the lamplight. He worked for Corwin before any of this, before me. Man keeps a thing like that buried under his own floor instead of burning it, Jed said. He's not hiding it from the law. He's keeping it in case the law ever comes looking. They should have moved faster than they did. In the last week of August, a stranger rode into what remained of Bitter Creek asking after the old Voss place, and word of it reached Jed inside 2 days, the way word travels in country with more grass than people. He arrived on the last night of a hard rainstorm, a heavy-set man named Silas Rourke, who worked, as it turned out, as a collector of debts and a settler of quiet disputes on Corwin's private payroll, and who had apparently been sent some days after Corwin's clerks noticed the county tax rolls showing the Voss parcel sold to determine what exactly Clara Voss thought she was doing back on land, the land and trust considered its own in all but the narrowest technical sense. He came at night, in the rain, on the theory reasonable, under other circumstances that a woman and an old man alone on an unfinished ranch would not be difficult to frighten off a piece of paper. He found the strong box open on the table and Clara standing over it with her father's hammer in her hand before he'd finished speaking his first sentence, and the confrontation that followed was short and ugly and entirely without the theater that such moments are so often given afterward in the telling. Rourke went for the ledger. Jed went for Rourke and took a blow to the ribs for his trouble that put him on the floor gasping. Clara did not think. She swung the hammer, the same hammer, worn smooth on one face, that her father had put in her hand when she was 12 years old, and told her to listen to the metal before she struck it and caught Rourke across the forearm as he reached for the strong box, hard enough to make him drop it, and hard enough in the driving rain, in the dark, in the general confusion of the moment, to convince him that whatever he was being paid, it was not enough to finish the job that night. He rode out into the storm with a broken arm and empty hands and did not come back. Clara and Jed sat on the floor of the unfinished house until the rain stopped, the strongbox between them, neither one saying much of anything, and in the gray light before dawn, they began, without discussing it, to pack the ledger and the letters and the removal document into a saddlebag. The nearest federal authority with jurisdiction to matter was a deputy U.S. Marshal named Thaddeus Ives, stationed 80 miles south in the territorial seat at Copper Bend, a man Jed had once described in his usual economical fashion as too stubborn to be bought and too old to care who's mad about it. They rode 2 days to reach him, the saddlebag never out of Clara's sight, and laid the whole of it on his desk. The second ledger, the 16 foreclosures, the letters from Whitcomb, the removal document with its $6,000 payment and its 4 words, resistance encountered. Matter resolved that Ives read twice, in silence, before setting the paper down with the particular care of a man handling something he understood to be evidence in the fullest legal sense. Ives did not act on faith. He spent 9 days verifying it, cross-checking the ledger's entries against county foreclosure filings, confirming Whitcomb still lived and would testify, wiring the territorial land office for the original 1,871 survey records to compare against the removal documents claimed boundary changes. Only when the pattern held under every test he could put to it did he swear out a warrant. Elias Corwin was arrested at his office in Bitter Creek on the 4th of September, 1901, by Marshal Ives and 2 deputies on charges that would eventually include fraud, forgery, and conspiracy in the matter of the 16 foreclosures, with the Talsani removal referred separately to federal authorities for further investigation. He did not resist, and he did not, according to the deputy who stood nearest him, change his expression. Even then, the legal accounting took the better part of a year, and is not, in truth, the part of this story that matters most. The note against Thomas Voss's ranch was found on examination by a handwriting expert Ives brought in from the territorial capital to bear a forged signature, and the original foreclosure was voided by court order in the spring of 1902, 12 years and some months after it had been executed, and largely academic by then, since Clara had already bought the land back herself for $42 and rebuilt the barn with her own hands before anyone in a courtroom got around to admitting she'd been wronged in the first place. 9 of the other 15 families whose ranches Corwin's ledger implicated were found and offered restitution from the dissolved land and trust company's assets. 6 could not be located. 1, it was learned, had died in the winter following their own foreclosure, in circumstances the county coroner's report from 1893 had recorded, without further comment, as exposure. Aaron Whitcomb testified twice, in Copper Bend and later before a federal circuit judge, and by the second appearance looked, according to Jed, who rode down to watch it, like a man who had been waiting 20 years to stop carrying something and had only just now been permitted to set it down. What became of the Talsani matter afterward moved slower than the fraud charges, referred as it was to authorities further off and further removed from Bitter Creek County than Marshall Ives's reach extended, and Clara understood, without anyone needing to explain it to her, that it was not a matter 12 years or 20 or even a courtroom could fully settle. She kept the removal document in her own strongbox afterward, not as a trophy, but because she had come to believe, the way her father apparently had, that some papers earn their keep simply by continuing to exist where someone might one day need them. 3 years on, in the autumn of 1904, the Voss Ranch carried 200 head of cattle, a rebuilt house with glass in every window, and a barn whose roof line sat as square and true as any structure in Bitter Creek County Square. Jed liked to say, because Clara Voss had never once in her life set a brace she wasn't willing to stake her own roof on. Jed stayed on. He never did admit, in so many words, that he'd been wrong about the barn, but he built himself a small cabin on the property that fall and showed no particular inclination to leave it, and Clara did not particularly want him to. He took to telling newcomers in town, with the flat authority of a man who had never once doubted anything in his life, that he'd known Clara Voss would make good on that ranch from the very first week he'd ridden over to tell her otherwise a version of events. Clara let stand uncontested, since by then she understood that Jed's pride and Jed's affection had always been the same coin, spent differently depending on the company. The hired hands who came on as the herd grew heard the story of the barn floor often enough that it passed, within a few seasons, from event into local legend, embellished a little more, with each telling, in the way such things always are. Clara let most of the embellishments stand too. She corrected only the one detail that mattered to her, that it hadn't been luck that found the strongbox, and it hadn't been luck that held the barn up long enough to find it. It had been work, unglamorous and daily, the kind nobody writes songs about until long after it's finished. The forge stood exactly where her father had built it, 40 feet from the house, and on winter evenings, the orange light of it was, once again, the last thing seen before sleep. Clara hung the hammer on its peg above the anvil where it had always hung in her father's day, though she still took it down most mornings, because a tool left idle, he had always told her, forgets its purpose faster than a man does. She thought of him most, in the end, not on the day the barn floor gave up its secret, and not on the day Corwin was led out of his office in irons, but on an ordinary Tuesday the following spring, shoeing a gelding in the cold exactly as he had, the hammer answering the nail in the rhythm he had taught her before she could read, and she understood then, in the plainest terms, the thing he had never quite managed to say outright while he was alive, that the strongbox under the floor had never been the inheritance. The ledger, the deeds, the money, owed, and finally repaid all of it was paper, and paper, however old, however damning, only ever proves what was taken. What her father had actually left her was standing in her hands, worn smooth on one face from his grip and then from hers, still telling her, every morning, where the metal wanted to bend. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't really a story about a barn or a ledger or even about Elias Corwin. It's a story about what outlasts a theft and what doesn't. Thank you for writing along on this one. If it found you tonight, consider subscribing and share it with someone who still keeps their father's tools on the wall. And before you go, I'd like to know, what's the one thing someone left you that turned out to be worth more than anything money could measure?